The book continues and lists several different categories of policies. They mention administrative, disaster recovery, information security, software design, usage, and user management. Actually, in a well-defined organization, you're going to have all of these. And especially if you have a whole lot of people in your organization where you spread out the different roles, you will have these policies that will apply to different users. I think the narrative here is pretty self-explanatory. Administrative policies talk about how you're going to do stuff. How often will you do upgrades? My policy for most of my clients is I do server restarts twice a month. Usually after Patch Tuesday, I wait 10 days to see if there's any fallout or things that need to be backed out, and then I go ahead and implement those updates. And I try and get all of those, all the ones that came out on Patch Tuesday, I try to get those in that cycle. And then there are always going to be some out-of-band updates, and I try and get those on the 2-week period right after that. I make sure that the users know that the upgrades are going to be installed on whatever night, and I make sure that I'm around in case there's something that happens the next day that's unexpected. Maybe the server comes up fine, but then some critical function isn't working. And so I stagger that for my clients. I've got one client on a Monday schedule and one on a Tuesday and one on a Wednesday. That way, if there is something that happens, I'll be available. Moving on, they've got disaster recovery plans. I think this is an accurate statement. It says it's one of the biggest headaches, but it's expensive, and you've got to keep it current. On the other hand, there is nothing more valuable if you lose a server. And I have had that happen 3 times in the past 5 years. A couple have been hardware, one has been a software corruption, but I had to go back to tape and restore. I was able to go back to the previous day because I made sure that we had a good backup plan, but I had to start from scratch. I had to make sure I had the installation media, that I had product codes, that once I got the OS up, then I had to reinstall the backup software. There are different ways you can do this, and some of these you can streamline. There's some pretty good products out now that will let you do that. It only takes once, and of course after it's happened, then people are willing to spend money on it. It's kind of hard to get people to budget for you to go through that entire process when they've never had any kind of an outage. Information policies. These deal with who accesses what, how long are you going to keep it current, when it's old and needs to be retired, how will you archive it, will you archive it, how will you destroy media if you need to do that. Security policies often deal with connectivity of your devices. They deal with passwords, they deal with reporting, they deal with data security. If you've got a VPN, then what are you going to use for your security protocols, antivirus software, password expirations, and complexity levels. That's the kind of thing you'll see in the security policies. In fact, if you look in the domain controller security policy and also just with the domain security policy, you'll see that there actually is a section on security policies. So that terminology is actually in use. Most people don't get into software design, at least not in the small business arena. But if you have a client or you work for a company that does a lot of in-house programming, you can have all sorts of policies there. And if you go out to a third party, then it's even more critical that you clearly define what your expectations are and what deliverables have to be there. The usage policy at its base is going to be a computer usage policy for your employees. What can you do on the internet? When can you get on the internet? Is your email private, or can you use your work email for personal use? Policies vary widely on that. Most installations will give you a little bit of flexibility on that, and then it's up to you to make sure that you don't cross the line, even though it may not be real apparent where that is. User management policies. What happens when you set up a new user? You set up the user, you set up email, you set up remote access. Hopefully you can maybe set up a brief orientation session with them to go over how email works, to go over what the drive mapping conventions are. With most of my clients, I try and spend maybe 30 or 45 minutes with new users, just so they're up to speed on the network and don't have to kind of reinvent the wheel as they get going. Employee terminations are another thing where you may need to give guidance to your client on this. Normally, it doesn't matter if people left on good terms or bad terms. You disable that account immediately. You tend to change passwords immediately, and you restrict access to anything that that user was working on. If someone is going to be leaving under less than ideal terms, hopefully management will let you know ahead of time so that you can maybe put auditing in place to make sure that this user doesn't go in and destroy data or compromise things. These are the types of things that you'll see in user management policies. The real world scenario here is kind of interesting. I think that if you went to most businesses here in Missoula and asked people these questions, they would just look at you, because most people do not have comprehensive policies in place. I think as an IT professional, it's good to make people aware of these, and when you have the opportunity, at least try and identify maybe what guidelines you want to use or what guidelines you think should be put in place when the appropriate activity comes to light. The next section of the text is entitled Understanding the Goals of Information Security. And again, we're looking kind of at a three-part cycle here. Prevention is your best effort at preventing bad things from happening to your network, whether it's unauthorized access, virus problems, data corruption, loss of data. There are all sorts of things that deal with prevention. And of course, as a security officer, if you are good at the prevention part, then things go pretty well and you don't have crises to deal with. However, you can't anticipate every situation, and so at some point there will be some sort of a security breach. That moves you into the next phase, which is detection. The detection portion of this can be kind of difficult sometimes. If you've got things automated, and especially if you are extremely busy, you may not actually notice when you've got a problem. I know I was working with a client once, and he didn't go into the server room very often because he used remote access to manage things. Well, it turned out he had maybe 7 servers in the rack, and 2 of them had failed hard drives. We went back and looked. One of them had failed 4 weeks ago. The other had failed 6 weeks ago. With RAID controllers, you can lose a drive and pick up your hot spare, and nobody knows the difference. But it's kind of unsettling that you had a device failure and it wasn't noted. The same thing with event logs. You can log all sorts of things, you can run reports, but unless you actually sit down and read them, all the logging in the world is not going to help. So sometimes people will get third-party utilities or set up email alerts. If you get too many email alerts, however, you're going to start ignoring those. You've got to work out a balance to where you can keep on top of this, but you're not going to be overwhelmed by that. Assuming that you are notified of some sort of a security breach or a loss, then the next phase is going to be response. Maybe you need to order hard drives, or maybe even need to have some on site. If you need to recover data, you have a lot of different ways you can do it. At its simplest, you can use volume shadow copies, and maybe the user can recover their data. The next step would be maybe to go to a backup, or if it's data that was lost maybe a long time ago and people only need it maybe every 6 months, you may have to go to offsite backups and recover that data. Same thing with some sort of a security breach. If it turns out that people hack into your firewall and get past your router security, then you need to either tighten that down or add an additional layer. The idea is, okay, somebody came in a certain way, what can we do to prevent that from happening? And like I said earlier, there's always going to be a cost associated with this. Usually it's management's job to figure out, okay, is it appropriate to throw $1,000 at this to prevent this? Is the risk high enough that it warrants this? Or do we want to spend $10,000 because the risk is so great or because the data is so valuable? Other companies would say, you know what, this data is could be replaced, it's not confidential, and so maybe we don't even care too much about this, and maybe we'll upgrade our firmware and we'll go from there. The next section in the text is entitled Comprehending the Security Process. And this is kind of a mixed bag of several different things that all come into play when you're trying to implement security. I think the very first thing that you need to do in a network is make sure that you've got good antivirus software. Usually, I try and implement 2 different antivirus packages. People have their life's ambition is to hack into things or to get viruses out and infect people. It's always a game of catch-up. Everybody uses different scanning mechanisms, uses different algorithms to detect viral activity, and it's a good idea usually to have a couple layers of defense there. Pretty much when I am setting up new workstations or new servers, after I get an operating system installed, the very next thing that I do is install antivirus software.